Good afternoon. This is a very exciting time. We have our keynote address now, and I have the honour to introduce him. Dr. Richard Harris is his name, but I think he's known as Harry Harris. And I think very few people in the room haven't heard of Dr. Harris. He's an anaesthetist in Adelaide, and he also works in the aeromedical medicine unit in Adelaide. But his passion is cave diving, and that was his kind of hobby. But I think they both converged when he was doing a thyroid case, I think, when he got a phone call from the divers who were involved in the rescue in northern Thailand of 12 young boys and their instructor, so 13 people. So I think his life probably changed after that, and we're looking forward to hearing about it in that. I think many of us have seen the rescue, which is online, and it's a phenomenal watch, and it's done very well and great footage, so I would recommend you all watch that if you haven't. He's also written a book called The Art of Risk, and I do think he's a risk taker, and I'm sure you will hear all about it when he talks to us about his topic, which is anesthesia in the dark. All of us, I think, watching, if we've watched The Rescue, got tachycardias when we were watching it, and it was a phenomenal achievement. He's been honoured by the Association of Anaesthetists. He got the PASC Award, which is their award for courage and for anaesthetists involved in this sort of courageous acts. And also, he was voted Australian Person of the Year in 2019, and many other awards, deservedly so. So we are honoured and delighted that he has come to that meeting here in Birmingham, and he's going to talk to us about anaesthesia in the dark. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Sajay, and the faculty. It's an absolute honour to be here. I'm a great fan of DAS and all the work that's been done by them over many years, and certainly has informed our practice and made our patients much more safe whilst we practice anaesthesia. I would disagree with one point, that I'm certainly not a risk taker. I'm sure I'm much like all of you. I'm a good risk manager, in my opinion, and that's certainly what I explained to my wife when she says, "Why are you going cave diving again?" Because like all things, like anaesthesia, cave diving is one of those pastimes which should be 99% boredom and pleasure, and only 1% terror. And I feel like my training as an anaesthetist and my training as a cave diver have really got a great synergy and a lot of overlap. I've entitled my talk Anaesthesia in the Dark, but in keeping with the theme of this conference, I think it actually would have been better called How to Make 13 Perfect and Easy Airways into 13 Very Difficult Ones by submerging them underwater and in an opaque environment and turning the lights out. So, I mean, these boys were perfect anaesthetic specimens, and it was only what we proposed to do to them that made their airways potentially difficult. It's nice to be back here in Birmingham, because in 1991 I actually started my anaesthetic practice as an SHO in Warwick, doing anaesthesia and intensive care there. And so it's very nice to come back to this part of the world. And I was reflecting last night on, all those years ago when I started out, and I went to the ODP stream this morning. As someone mentioned, that used to be ODAs, but back when I was here, and think about the times that those ladies and gentlemen saved not only my career, but my patients' lives. I'm sure as many of you would have had that experience as young anaesthetists starting out in such a busy system like the NHS. But around 1991, I'd already been diving in the ocean for about 12 years and had already been cave diving for about 6 years. So in many ways, this rescue in Thailand seemed to have my name on it. It seemed to be part of fulfilling my destiny almost. I felt that I was going to be involved or become involved in something that could use those two different skill sets that I'd been working so hard on to develop. Now, I've only got 30 minutes to tell a story that took over a couple of weeks, so I better crack on with the account itself. And apologies to those of you who probably know this story better than I do now from watching all the TV shows and reading the books and getting the T-shirt. But hopefully I can give you a different personal perspective as to what you might have seen in the news or by watching those accounts. So it is over 5 years ago now that these 12 boys from the Moopah, or the Wild Boars soccer team, finished their training on a Saturday morning at the local soccer club, and along with their 25-year-old coach, they decided to go off to the Tamlawan cave for a bit of an adventure. Now, I think when you're a young boy in a remote and rural part of northern Thailand, and you're surrounded by this fantastic jungle and mountains and this most excellent cave, that's exactly what you should be doing as a young lad or laddess. And on this occasion, they went back to the cave, and they'd actually been in there many times before. In fact, it had become a bit of a ritual for the team. On this occasion, it was one of the boys' 15th birthday parties, but they often took new teammates in there for a bit of an initiation. And it was a perfect day. The sun was shining. There was no sign of rain. There's a sign out the front of the cave that says from July till November is the cave flooding season. So they were inside the safe period of time. But every single year the monsoon does arrive sometime in July or August, and that cave will very predictably flood. And in fact, you can see in this photo that was taken on the evening that the boys failed to return from the cave still looks dry. But within about 48 hours, there'll be a very powerful river flowing out of the entrance to that cave. Now, just to put you on the map, we're in the very most northern part of Thailand, right up against the border of Myanmar, obviously formerly Burma. And these boys lived in a bit of a transient community. They're actually mostly from Myanmar. They were from a minority tribe called the Shan people, and their parents travelled back and forth across a fairly open border and traded in the market by and large in that little village of Mae Sai. And so the reason to tell you that is that these boys had a pretty tough upbringing. I don't think they'd ever lacked a roof over their heads or food on the table, but life was quite hard for them. They were very poor people. And actually, I think that resilience that was born through those years of a little bit of hardship would stand them in very good stead when it comes time to what they're about to face inside this cave. Now, if you jump in a car and travel to the south down to that yellow pin, that is the entrance to the Tamlawan cave, and it's only about 10 minutes in a car. These boys rode their bikes down there. And from the pin, you travel into the west, and I'll show you a map of the cave shortly, but you travel into the west underneath that cloud to a part of the cave where there's a T-junction. It's about 1.6 kilometres into the cave, and at that point the cave branches to the north and south. So I'll just show you that map now. So the bicycle there obviously showing the entrance to the cave, and 1.6 k's into the T-junction. And if you stand at that T-junction and you look to the north, that part of the cave, the very skinny bit called the Monk Series, is a very uninviting bit of cave. It's a sort of a muddy tube, and you would to go up there, as some cavers have obviously done because they've created this map, but you'd have to crawl and winkle up into this pretty uninviting bit of cave. But if you turn left and go south, the tunnel is much more open and easy walking passage, and so we were pretty confident that's the way that the boys would have gone. And in fact, when they had gone in there before, this cave, which has 10 kilometres of tunnels in it, they would go about 5 kilometres to the south from the entrance, where they had a bit of a special chamber, almost like their club room, that they would go to, and they would usually write their initials in the mud and then turn around and come back out. And that's what they did on this occasion, and they just got back to the T-junction, and it's at that point that they realised that the cave passageway in front of them was flooded with water, and that's because that's actually the lowest part of the entire cave. And what they hadn't realised was that when they went in, it was already raining over the other side of the mountain range, and the earth was becoming more and more sodden until suddenly the water had come up through the ground and had started to flood that part of the cave. And then second to that, the water had started flowing down that Monk Series and was pouring into the T-junction itself. So over the next couple of days, the cave, as I mentioned, did completely flood. A river started to appear out of the entrance, And the blue parts of the cave on this map now show the parts of the cave that would actually require scuba diving to pass through, a total of about 1 kilometre of cave passage that required diving. And in between those bits there would be like a river flowing through the cave between ankle deep and over your head in depth. So quite a significant obstacle. Now, when the cave started flooding, the boys were obviously, trapped and worried, and the first night they just slept on this sandy beach there. The next morning they awoke to find water lapping at their feet as the water started to rise. And they spent that next couple of days before it flooded completely just walking up and down that southern passage between the red circle and the T-junction, looking for another exit or looking for a way to escape. And on day 3, they were around about where the red circle is, and they suddenly felt some wind and a bit of a noise coming down the tunnel, and they looked up to see a tidal wave or a flash flood coming around the corner. And it was heading towards them, and they were very lucky that they were standing right at the base of the only bit of high ground in the entire cave. And when you stand at the bottom in that red circle and you look up, there's a very steep, muddy slope that goes up about 10 or 12 metres, and at the top of that is a flat, muddy platform where they could all sit together. So when they saw the water, they all sprinted up this hill. The water rushed past literally as the coach was following them up, and they sat at the top of this hill, an area probably between me and that desk in size, all huddled together. They were just wearing their t-shirt and shorts from the training, no shoes or socks. They were already wet from being in the damp cave. These boys are all very fit, skinny little kids between 11 and 16 years of age, and their weights range between about 30 and 60 kilos. And they had no food with them whatsoever, so they basically sat there over the next, or total of 9 days, until they were found by those British cavers. So you can imagine how desperate that must have been for those little boys, thinking that no one knew where they were because they actually hadn't told their parents where they were going that day. It's probably the only mistake they made, in my opinion. And they had no food, so they were increasingly hungry and increasingly cold. The temperature in the cave was about 23 degrees Celsius, so not cold, but remember they were wet and starving, so they did start to suffer from mild hypothermia as they sat there. And you can well imagine that their morale would have just started to plummet when they realised that now not only does no one know where they are, but also the cave is flooded, and even if their location was known, how could anyone possibly come in to rescue them? So I suspect they realised they were almost certainly going to die at that point. Now, in the early hours of that first Sunday morning when they were missing, the police, the emergency services all appeared on site, and it was realised that they need someone who was expert in their knowledge of the cave, and they called a British guy called Vern Unsworth, who was from Yorkshire originally, but now living in that part of Thailand because of the profusion of caves in the area. And Vern had contributed to the mapping of this cave, so he knew it very well. And he went into the cave at about 2 a.m, and he went as far as the T-junction, and he could see the water pouring in through this hole in the wall, the entrance to the Monk series. And he described it as just a really chaotic scene, a big whirlpool forming, deafeningly loud noise from the water. And he realised in that moment that if these boys had any chance of survival, if they hadn't in fact been killed in that initial flooding event, then they might need some cave divers to come over and help search for them. And being British, he knew of the British cave diving community, and he put out the call via the governor of Chiang Rai province, who contacted the British embassy, who contacted, through the British Cave Rescue Commission or Council, these two guys. And in our fairly minority sport of cave diving, and I'm not really sure why it's not a little bit more popular, but there don't seem to be a lot of people keen to participate. But in our small global community, these two guys are really the rock stars of our sport, and I'm very proud to be friends of these guys, particularly the guy on the left, Rick Stanton, and his long-time dive buddy, John Valanthan. Now, Rick was a firefighter just over the road in Coventry, and I'd been on a couple of expeditions previously with Rick, so I knew him quite well, and I certainly knew of John and many of the other British cave divers. It's a very popular sport, in fact, in Britain, and a lot of the legends of the sport and a lot of the history of cave diving comes from this country. So you're certainly batting above your weight, I suppose, in that particular sport. Unfortunately, also in rugby and some other places, but anyway. So Rick and John arrived on scene, and when I heard that they were there, and I'd been following this event for quite a long time, really from when the boys went missing. Rick and John arrived on that Wednesday, so about 5 days after the kids went missing, and they immediately got their gear on, went down to the entrance of the cave, and they faced two obstacles. And the first one wasn't the cave itself, but actually it came in the form of the captain of the Thai Navy SEAL Regiment, who was pretty much standing guard at the entrance to the cave. And when he saw these two old blokes rock up in their homemade wetsuits and equipment, cave divers are very proud of our innovative MacGyver sort of approach to problem solving. And these guys are kind of the best of that in that regard. So when you see Rick in his ensemble of homemade diving equipment, it's pretty, it's not awe-inspiring, let's put it that way. So, compared to the spit and polish of the Thai Navy SEAL Regiment, you can imagine that they looked singularly unimpressive. And the captain was pretty blunt in his criticism of them. And Rick and John, very good cave divers, but perhaps not the best diplomats in the world. So a bit of a stoush ensued, and in the end the captain said, look, if you silly old blokes want to go and kill yourself in the cave, that's entirely up to you, but we're taking no responsibility. So Rick and John went off into the cave, and very shortly after reappeared with their tail between their legs because of the force of the water that was coming out of the cave. It was really impossible to dive in there. But to their credit, they went back and tried again the next day, same result. But then on the Friday, something seemed to have changed, and probably a combination of two things. The rains had eased off, and secondly, that the water pumping operations that were in place started to take hold, and they found that they could make their way forwards into the cave. Now, when you're cave diving in water like this, remember that the annual monsoon essentially at the moment is flushing out a year's worth of mud and grot out of the cave. So it was basically like swimming through iced coffee or chocolate milk. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And when I'm diving in water like that, I tend to close my eyes. It's just less confronting than staring at the darkness. There's no point turning a light on of any kind. And so they would have been feeling their way forwards, just pulling themselves hand over hand through some very tightly restricted parts of the cave. And of course, always dragging a bag full of climbing rope behind them and tying that off every 20 or 30 metres so that they could always find their way back out of the cave. That's sort of rule 101. If you're thinking about taking up cave diving, that's the first lesson. Always have a piece of string to find your way home. And so incredibly difficult and courageous bit of diving. And between them and the Navy SEALs and some other European cave divers that were on site, but the lion's share of the work done by these two guys, finally on day 9 they surfaced in Chamber 9, and you probably recall that incredible bit of footage from John Valanthen's GoPro camera when they see these kids, these very skinny ghostly figures coming down 9 days after they've been missing, coming down this hill, and John calls out, "How many of you are there?" And one of the boys, Adul, who speaks a little bit of English, says 13, and John goes, "Brilliant." And at that point, I think this is when the story became a global phenomenon. That footage actually came out of the cave via a fibre optic link from Chamber 3 that the SEALs had set up. That footage came out of the cave before John and Rick got out of the cave. So when they got outside and everyone was applauding and cheering, and of course the parents of the kids there were just crying with joy, Rick and John thought something else must have happened, and they didn't realise that the news was already out of the cave. But those of us sort of in the know were thinking when we heard this news, well, actually that's probably less than half of this problem solved, because how do you get 13 boys who we were told at the time couldn't even swim, how do you get them 2.4 kilometres out of a cave, which was going to require diving through some extremely difficult and technical countryside underwater there? So I'd been talking to Rick via WhatsApp, and as was mentioned, I was in the operating theatre. It's interesting to hear that talk about thyroids, because I've never been a believer in tracheomalacia myself, and so I was doing my regular thyroid list that morning and exchanging a few sneaky texts with Rick Stanton. Normally when I give this talk to a group of bankers or accountants and they hear that, what do you mean you're doing texting while you're patient? I say, well, don't worry, half the anaesthetists I know are doing the crossword or looking at their stock market or something. At least I was working for good. And so Rick and I continued to message that morning, and then he rang me at the end of my list, and basically he was asking 3 days after these kids had been found, he was saying there's no possible way the kids are coming out alive. He wanted to leave Thailand because he didn't want to stick around just to do the body recoveries. And then he came up with this outrageous idea. He said, is sedation possible, so that we could sedate the kids to stop them panicking while we dive them out of the cave? And I don't think you have to be an anaesthetist, and you don't have to be a cave diver to realise that a 3-hour underwater journey whilst you're unconscious is not going to end well. So I just said, no, that is impossible. I did know about Edgar Pask and his, when he invented the Bain circuit, and he was anaesthetised and intubated and put in the swimming pool at the Royal Physiological Laboratories. Edgar's always been one of my heroes, which was why it was so gratifying to receive that award. That was the only case I knew of the combination of immersion and anaesthesia, and yet I was being asked to consider, this unprecedented technique to try and rescue these boys. So I was very clear on the phone. I said, no, it's absolutely impossible. I had in my mind 3 very major concerns, and I had about another 100 sort of other concerns. But the 3 major concerns were that obviously if you're going to render someone unconscious with an anaesthetic, and lay people use the word sedation, but obviously I knew there's no sedating these boys. They have to be unconscious if they're going to be brought out without panicking. Even if we use a full face mask, which will secure the airway because they can't hold a mouthpiece in their mouth, that mask will flood at some point over a 3-hour journey, and you don't need very much water in the oronasal cup of a full face mask to drown a small boy. If that didn't kill them, then secondly, at some point in 3 hours, in the dark, unmonitored, unsupervised, these boys will lose their airway, whether it's positional or they're rolled on their back and their tongue drops back, or just laryngospasm from a bit of water or saliva. It is not possible to maintain an airway in that environment. And if those 2 things didn't kill them, well, I was absolutely confident that they would die of hypothermia. Immersion obviously removes a lot of body heat combined with anaesthesia. The temperature is 23 degrees. Their temperature is going to head south towards 23 degrees, and surely in 3 hours it's going to get pretty close to that level. So, all of this was not just informed by my anaesthesia career and my theoretical concerns. I'd also been working for about the last 12 years or so in cave rescue, and through selfish concerns, mainly about what would happen if I injured myself in a remote chamber that required diving to get an injured or an unwell caver back out to the surface, I had developed this capability in Australia and New Zealand, testing different techniques for taking injured or sick divers out through a sump, through a flooded section of cave. And so I've been running these courses for some time, and as part of those courses, at one stage I remember putting on a full face mask myself and pretending to be unconscious and getting my friends to sort of push me around underwater and turn me upside down and so forth. And I found that slowly but surely the mask would fill up with water unless I took active steps to clear the water out, which of course I had plenty of incentive to do. So I was 100% certain that these boys would die if we proceeded with this plan. But I agreed to go to Thailand, and very shortly after that the Australian government contacted me. And I remember starting this thought process whilst I was sitting in Adelaide Airport with my bags of diving gear, and thinking about, well, if you did this, what drugs would you use, for example? And so I sort of wrote down a list of things and very quickly started to cross things off the list for various different reasons. And The answer very quickly came to me that ketamine was the only possible solution to this problem if we were to go ahead with it, for all the reasons that I'm sure I don't need to explain to this audience. But I was also very reassured by the thought of using ketamine because I had worked in developing countries for a couple of years. I had worked a lot in the retrieval space and obviously, like all of us, done high-risk anaesthetics with ketamine. So I felt very, very comfortable with the use of ketamine, although that would become a bit more complicated as it turned out as we started to use it in a way that it hadn't been used before. So over to Thailand I went and I met up with the British divers, and the first thing I wanted to do was spend 24 hours sort of taking stock of the situation, trying to find any other way that these boys were coming out alive before I would commit to doing something so foolhardy, to be honest, as what was being proposed. Now, there was a lot of stuff in place, and I won't dwell on that, but just give you one example, and that was some of the water pumping operations. So there were these big drill rigs down near the entrance to the cave, drilling down into the aquifer, into the groundwater, and pumping millions and millions of litres of water out into a man-made canal, which was taking all the water out into these rice paddies. And obviously, if we could lower the whole water table, then throughout the cave, the water level would drop, and hopefully we could create an airspace where we could just swim or snorkel these kids out of the cave. And what I subsequently learnt was that many hundreds of these local farmers all agreed for their crops to be destroyed by this pumping operation, and that's exactly what happened as they all flooded. And, when you think about how poor these local farmers would be and the impact of losing an annual rice crop would be to them, it just made me stop and realise what an extraordinary example of global volunteerism, including these local farmers, this whole event was. And, when I realised, how much people sacrificed to help these boys, then it really did make me very proud to be a part of this operation. It was quite extraordinary. But my first priority, apart from that, of course, was my own safety, which it should be for anyone who's putting themselves in harm's way in the emergency services or wherever. And so the first priority also was for Craig and I, my Australian dive buddy who came with me. The first priority was for us to dive the cave and go and see the boys. I remember Rick Stanton, God's gift to cave diving, saying to me, "Oh, Harry, the cave, it's a bit sporting, but I think you'll be all right." It's just like, okay, well, if the Edmund Hillary of cave diving says it's a bit sporting, then there's good reason that I should be concerned. And so Craig and I set off to dive the cave to see if we were capable. And I have to say it was a bit sporting, but you have to also remember this is what we do for fun on the weekends. So, people have said, oh, that was very brave to dive in the cave. Well, not entirely, because we felt very comfortable in that environment, and it is our chosen pastime. So I never felt that my life was in any great danger in the cave itself. For me, it was always the moral dilemma for what to do about these boys. The other reason to dive the cave, of course, was to see the boys for myself and make this very abstract concept and plan into something more concrete that I could get my head around. And of course, in some ways that was a mistake, because once I saw these 12, beautiful boys and their coach in the back of that cave, there was no possible way I was leaving Thailand until those kids were coming out. And, when I first met those boys and realised what extraordinary resilience and courage that they had, that has started this kind of journey for me since 2018 to try and inspire young people and therefore probably young parents to allow this to happen, to allow young people to do more adventurous things, to take sensible risks and to learn how to be risk managers like we all need to be. Life isn't easy, and kids these days need to, I think, have a little bit of tough love to grow up facing some physical and mental challenges and not having the way just paved for them to make life too easy. But anyway, that's a slight sidebar there. Anyway, so we saw these kids, and they are actually, after 9 days of no food, just surviving by drinking the water in the cave, they look remarkably well. They were all standing and walking and talking still. The British divers had been taking food in there for the last few days, and 4 Navy SEALs had gone in there to join them and stay with them and look after them. The overall effect of the food and the extra people in there, of course, was the environment in this chamber was rapidly deteriorating, and I don't need to spell out the obvious reasons why, but the smell in there was unbelievable, it's fair to say. And it was clear to me that the risk of infection in that chamber was starting to become very high. And also we measured the oxygen level in the chamber, and it came back as 15.2%. So life in this place was not sustainable for very long. We were also told at this stage by the meteorologists that the monsoon was coming back, and this time it was going to stick, and that would happen in 3 to 5 days. So that kind of set the clock ticking for us. We had to do something, and we only essentially had 3 days to do it. Otherwise, these boys would stay in there, and they would definitely die from infection or exposure or hypoxia. So whilst Craig and I dived the cave, your British colleagues and some guys from the US Air Force got 3 kids from the local swimming pool and took them down to the pool and started to dress them up in the way that we might propose to do this cave diving rescue technique. And of course, the full face mask was the critical part of this. And, you know, I've already told you about my experience with full face masks and how I had no confidence in this. One of the problems was finding full face masks to fit, 30-kilo boys, because these things are made for commercial divers who look more like me than a skinny little Thai boy. And there was only one brand of mask that would really fit these kids if it was done up tightly enough, and we only had 4 examples of it. So 4 became the rate limiting step for how many of the kids we would get out during each day. Now, as again a little sidebar, I was curious, you all know this was successful, right? So I'm not giving you any spoiler alert there, but I was very curious as to what the role of this full face mask played in the success of this experience, and why did it work when it had seemed to be failing in my hands. And the reason was that these masks had a positive pressure function. They were basically acting like a CPAP mask. And so, to sort of follow up that inquiry, I sent one of these masks off to a friend of mine in the top right there, Professor Simon Mitchell at Auckland University. He's the head of anaesthesiology there, but he also has a very strong interest in diving medicine. And he's got this fantastic lab where he can, along with his colleague, Dr. Nick Gant, do really practical tests on diving equipment. So I sent him one of these masks, and they made a little swimming pool in their lab, got their PhD student in the pool with the full face mask all plumbed up into some spirometry, and then did some pressure testing on the masks. And you can actually switch the positive pressure function on and off. And on the left there you can see above the red line, which is a 0 pressure line, this mask actually delivers between 5 and 10 centimetres of positive pressure throughout the respiratory cycle, and when you turn it off, it dips well down into the negative readings on inhalation. So I think this had a huge part to play in terms of why the airway was kept dry, because obviously if there's a leak in the mask, it just blows air out rather than letting water in, but also why they maintained some saturations probably during their unmonitored anaesthetic experience for 3 hours as they came out of the cave. And of course, like all good students of medicine, we publish our findings. And this article is probably worth a look if you are interested, because it has got all the medical detail that I don't have time to go into here, published in Diving and Hyperbaric Medicine, the foremost journal in the diving hyperbaric literature. The plan as it stood started to take shape like this, that myself and the four British divers, there were some others there by this stage, would go to the far end of the cave. We would get 4 kids in their wetsuits. One by one they would come down that muddy hill, they'd sit on my lap, I'd inject them in the leg with a dose of ketamine, and once they were asleep, after the intramuscular injection, then we would finish dressing them in their full face mask, strap a cylinder of 80% oxygen to their chest, a bit of extra oxygen obviously for the anaesthetic, and in case, or in my opinion, when they inevitably drowned, it might improve our chances of resuscitating them. And then one British diver would take each boy all the way out through the cave to chamber 3, which marked the end of the cave diving component of the rescue. So that was the plan. We re-met together that night. Craig and I had been to see the kids. The Brits had been to the pool to test the equipment. Everything seemed to be working. My opinion on the success rate of the mission hadn't changed. Nothing that I'd seen had really, changed my opinion of what was going to be the outcome. But I realised in these late night meetings with the Thai leadership that I had to make a decision as to whether I was prepared to do this or not. And it's very hard to sort of explain the moment that the decision came to me, and that was that I just had to try this. But I think, I was able to make that decision with some clarity and some peace of mind, basically because the alternative to trying something was doing nothing. And to get on a plane and fly back to Adelaide knowing that would condemn these boys to a brutal death, let alone the psychological impact of them the next day realising that we weren't coming back, was just not something I could live with. And I think, activity, affirmative action sometimes is easier than doing nothing. And, hopefully there might be a minute to ask questions about, the morality of this or the informed consent, which was essentially zero. I kind of consoled myself by saying, well, at least when these boys die, then they'll be asleep when that happens, which is obviously pretty poor justification for a plan, but it just seemed to me the right thing to do at that moment. So I went off to bed, and as I did, I asked the Thai medical corps from the army to prepare the ketamine. I hadn't really thought through the fact that I wasn't going to be able to take each of these boys out myself and monitor them as best I could underwater. But in fact, the British divers were going to have to become anaesthetists, because I assumed that the intramuscular ketamine, 5 milligrams per kilo roughly, was going to last half or 3/4 of an hour. But then they were going to need top-ups. And I frantically searched the literature for maintenance of anaesthesia with intramuscular ketamine. There seemed to be exactly 0 references for that. So I thought, well, half the dose, I guess, for the top-ups. And I couldn't really have the Brits drawing up drugs underground. So what I did was decide that we'll just divide the boys into 2 groups, and hoping that ketamine was as forgiving as I remembered, we'd call them small kids and big kids, and the small kids would be based around 40 kilos, the big kids would be based around 50 kilos, and I'd pre-prepare all the ketamine along those lines, so that all the Brits had to do when their child started to moan or move or wake up, then all they would have to do is decide whether it was a small or a big one, and then pick up the correct label syringe, which said small or large, and put a needle on it and stick it in their leg. And I just said, look, as long as you get it in the flesh of their upper thigh, then it will work. If you hit the bone, don't worry, just come back a bit. The only thing you can do wrong, basically, is inject yourself or inject their wetsuit. If you do that, either of those 2 things, the boys will not go to sleep. And so this is me giving my now somewhat famous anaesthesia lecture to the British divers. I had 20 minutes to impart my 6 years of postgraduate study. And at this point, there's normally a surgeon in the audience who says, well, we've always told you that a trained monkey could do your job. And sadly, it would appear that is the case, because these British guys did an extraordinary job, and it's really a testament to their courage and pragmatism that they did this, and apparently did it very successfully. So fast forward to the end of the cave, and that's me in the white helmet. That boy's been anaesthetised. Chris Jewell, one of the Brits, is helping me put the cylinder of oxygen on his chest, and then Chris will go away and prepare his own equipment. And then whilst he's gone, I'll just do some testing, putting the boys' faces in the water, and then quickly lifting them up to check for a leak in the mask. Again, hard to explain what that felt like, the first time that I did that to one of these tiny little boys. The feeling really that this is something so amoral, not just as a medical practitioner, but as a human, I think. It's just something that seems very, very wrong. Probably only thing worse than that was the fact that we decided to tie their hands behind their backs and tie their ankles together. Because we wanted them to be as streamlined as possible, so the Brits could push them through the water without any fear of them getting tangled up or trapped in the tight parts of the cave. But also in case the boys woke up unexpectedly and panicked, which you would obviously expect, and they would reach up and either rip their own mask off or do the same to the British diver. And obviously I couldn't live with that on my conscience if any of the other divers were killed in this. So, as you know, they all survived, excuse me, they all survived, but I liaised quite a bit with one of the Thai army anaesthetists after this and got some of the information from him. And, you know, they did suffer some severe respiratory depression during the exit. Some of the boys were only breathing 2 or 3 times a minute on their way out. One boy stopped breathing, and I was just about to give him mouth to mouth at one point, but he just, with a bit of a jaw thrust and a bit of stimulus, he started breathing again. A few of them came out with chest x-ray changes and some altered saturations, whether that was aspiration or some pre-existing chest infections that they had accumulated in the cave, I'm not sure. But most interesting to me was their core temperatures, and only one, in fact, it was the coach, who was 60 kilos, had a profoundly dangerous core temperature of 29.6. The rest of them, I'd have to say, in my career, I've certainly taken patients out to the recovery ward with lower temperatures than that. So I was astonished how they could maintain their temperatures. And again, in the end, to explain how this worked, I guess it was the ketamine and that slight sympathomimetic effect, you know, perhaps causing some peripheral vasoconstriction and stopping them losing so much heat. I'm sure any other sedative drug, obviously including alcohol, you know, just makes us vasodilate, and they would have died from hypothermia. But another tick in the box, perhaps, for ketamine being the wonder drug for cave diving rescue, at least. So just in finishing up, and I'm sure I've gone over time because I always do, sorry, but I just want to finish with this photo of one of the young boys who was 11 years old. His nickname is Titan, which is probably a name he needed to grow into a little bit. He's exactly 30 kilos. The smallest boy was 29, as it turned out. And you can see from the size of his hand in mine how tiny he is. But the thing about Titan, like many of these boys, was that smile did not leave his face the entire time that I dealt with him in the cave. And, you know, what was it about these boys that made them so resilient? And I'm sure many people in their situation literally would have died before their resources or their substrates would have dried up. And I wondered, was it their Thai culture or their Buddhist faith? Or according to Dr. Puck, the Thai Navy SEAL doctor who was in there with me, he said, no, they're just tough country kids, Harry. And this is, you know, if you took a bunch of school kids from Bangkok, one of the high schools, they probably would have been hopeless. But like all country kids, certainly in Australia, they have an additional level of robustness because, again, they're allowed out and about to get up to mischief and find their limits, find their own way of managing risk. And I just repeat that I think that's an incredibly important message for all of us to do things that are hard, that frighten us, and that challenge us to you know, become the best we can be. So thank you for listening. I probably haven't left time for questions, but it was certainly a bit of a rush. I'm sorry. Thank you. But I'm here for lunch and this afternoon if you want to have a chat.
I was told...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Got my Australian mate to stand up. That's much harder. Thank you very much.
I was told at the beginning of this, even if we overran, that a few questions would be allowed. I think that standing ovation is first for DAS, so congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So we'll take 1 or 2 questions that people might have. I just have one with regard to the pharmacology. Did you use any other medication? I
did. That was a very expurgated version of this whole story. I'm sorry, it was a bit compressed. But yeah, I gave the kids all a tiny homeopathic dose of alprazolam. I was just fearful of, you know, their anxiety, obviously, and also worrying about emergence phenomenon. None of these children have any recollection after the injection of ketamine. None of them remember anything until they woke up either in the ambulance or the helicopter or in the Chiang Rai hospital, and certainly no bad dreams. One of them reported some dreaming, and that was he was being rescued by King Rama IX, who was the last king, who was very much loved by the Thai population, and so that was a very good dream for him to have. I also gave him some atropine, 20 mics per kilo, with that first intramuscular injection, just as an anti-silagogue, because I was so frightened about them drowning just even from saliva inside that mask. So that's the recipe, should you need to use it.
I think Tim Cook has a question.
Harry, firstly, thanks very much. It's an absolutely amazing story. I've not seen the next Netflix documentary, or I think there's another film, isn't there? Really quite emotional listening to you describe, I think, what for me seems like extraordinary personal bravery for you doing what you did. And I just wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about that picture with you standing with the anaesthetised child over the opaque waters, injecting them, and you described thinking that they were going to drown, thinking that they were going to die, and you said that you were in a sort of a moral situation where you could do no, you were stuck between literally a rock and a hard place, and I just wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about that, if you're willing to. I just think it was an act of extraordinary bravery, and until you understood that actually a few of them had got some distance, it must have been extraordinarily difficult to inject the first, the second, the third, and the fourth child.
It's amazing what humans can rapidly become conditioned to under, adverse circumstances. And I don't consider myself brave or courageous. I consider that I was incredibly lucky to have exactly the right set of skills to help these boys. And so I just had this strong sense that the moment I read about these kids in the paper on about day 2, I knew I was going there and I knew I was going to be involved. And I'm probably a little naive, I'm probably a little quick to rush into things. That's always been my way without perhaps thinking through all the implications of my actions. My wife has a nickname for me, which is Bullet-a-Gate Harris, which means that obviously you do stupid things without thinking. But sometimes those qualities can enable you to have a go without thinking things through too much, because I'm sure if I'd stopped to really think about all the implications of this, then perhaps I would have lost the courage to proceed. And I have no doubt at all, looking back, that had even one of those boys died, then 2 things would have happened. Firstly, I wouldn't be here talking about it, because the guilt that I would have felt about that would have been profound. Secondly, that I think I would have been very harshly judged by my peers, and I knew it was a stupid and reckless thing to be doing. I thought it wouldn't work. So if someone else did it and all the kids died, I would be fairly critical of them, I suspect, doing something like this. And the only reason I had for contemplation or worry after the event was that I wondered that there must be something wrong with me, to go ahead and do something like this. Who in their right mind, believing truly that he was euthanizing these kids, would proceed with that. But I can tell you there was no possible alternative for me. There was no way I could get on a plane and fly home knowing that I was leaving those children to that terrible death. And so I felt that I had no choice but to at least try something. And at the very least, we were returning these boys to their parents, and otherwise they were going to be presented with their skeletal remains in about 6 months' time. And, as a parent, I felt that this was the right thing to do, whatever the outcome and whatever cost that came to me as. So it didn't feel courageous, it just felt like the only possible option that I had.
Again, I think we'll close this session now. I know you'll be around over lunch if people have some questions, but thank you very much for such an insightful personal account of an amazing, amazing achievement, and thank you.
Great. Thank you. Cheers.